All they had to do was nothing. Literally nothing. They could have just sat there, maybe call a few other GMs and some agents just to make sure that the old boys club knows that they're still around and at least giving it the old college try, but in the end, just don't make any signings. And yet, here we are. What's cracking, everybody, and welcome back to what has become somewhat of an annual tradition here of free agency rolling around and kind of hoping that the Kraken don't make any big mistakes, and inevitably they do make at least one. Now, I don't necessarily know that this year's mistake was that bad. It's still not a good contract. Is the one notable contract that they signed today is signing Ryan Lindgren to a 4-year, $4.5 million per year contract, which is, it's not necessarily that it's going to age poorly, it just doesn't start off in a good spot in the first place. So, yeah, when you start off at a low point, it's not like there's really much of anywhere to go other than to continue to be bad throughout the 4 years. So I guess as far as the questions of what was going to be different with Botterill as GM rather than Francis, if anything notable, well, so far it seems like everything is going just as it would have before. The Kraken make some pretty good trades, I think draft pretty well, then free agency rolls around and we are left wondering what the heck the plan with this franchise is, as they just seem to get it into their heads that they have to spend to the cap regardless of what available options there are. And again, one of the definite available options was to just not sign any free agents. This was not a particularly good free agent class in the first place. And then when really the only big prize of free agency in Mitch Marner ends up in Vegas, because of course star players available, Vegas is going to be in on it, and probably, at least more likely than not, they'll end up with him. And sure enough, Vegas does end up with Marner. So that'll only help the Kraken as we get further on into the future. Instead, the Kraken just go with a middle pair defenseman and give him way too much money. And I know what you're probably thinking in hearing that the Kraken just signed another middle pairing defenseman and a left shot defenseman at that. You're probably wondering, why do they need another middle pairing defenseman for somewhere between $4 and $6 million? Well, that is a very good question. They really don't need another defenseman for that much money to fill a spot in the middle pair. They have more than enough money spent already on the blue line, and they have plenty of defensemen at the NHL level. Though I will say this is maybe the one part of this signing that makes at least a little bit of sense. It is a very clear signal that this will be the last year of Jamie Oleksiak as a Kraken, if not already the last few hours, days, weeks, if he's gone before the season even starts via some sort of trade that the Kraken think that they can make happen before the start of the season. If that doesn't happen, then they'll figure out what to do with like 8 NHL defensemen on the roster, and then Oleksiak will be gone sometime before the deadline, unless somehow the Kraken still have Oleksiak and are still competitive at the deadline, in which case I suppose it's more injury insurance, and then Oleksiak is for sure gone at this time next year, as he'll leave in free agency, with this being the last year of his contract. So in some ways it's just the Kraken getting ahead of themselves and pre-preparing for Oleksiak's eventual departure. Now, if they already have some sort of plan in motion for trading Oleksiak, and this is a preparation for something that's just going to happen here in the next, again, few days or weeks, or maybe hours, because it would be very fitting for me to put a whole video together and then get it out, and then we see that Oleksiak gets traded. But unless it's going to happen here before the season gets started, it just seems like the Kraken getting too far ahead of themselves and rushing a decision that just didn't really need to be made. Because without a move in place to have Oleksiak out the door before the season gets started, even if you are committed to having Oleksiak moved at some point this season or at the end of it via free agency, there's really no reason to get ahead of yourselves and fill that role. If Oleksiak's going to be on the roster, I mean, it really doesn't have that much to do with Oleksiak specifically being on the roster, but just by the moves the Kraken have made so far, sure, the roster's probably marginally better than last year's, and yeah, you're going to hope that guys like Shane Wright and Beniers take step forwards and maybe get some contributions from some other prospects, but it's pretty clear from the moves that they've made, or maybe more so the moves that they haven't made, that they're not terribly interested in all the way taking one big leap into playoff contention in one offseason. They're just trying to set themselves up to maybe take that big step into it next year, especially with the commitment, at least from what we've heard so far, to not buying out Philip Grubauer. The team seems fairly content with just a minor improvement. And I guess if a playoff spot falls in your lap via a bunch of career seasons like it did the second year, or maybe a couple of teams falling apart like the Canucks and Flames, which is not out of the question, but unlikely. Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me to why you would make this decision now rather than just wait until next offseason and maybe there's a trade to be had during the year or something better can come along than paying Ryan Lindgren $4.5 million for the next 4 years. Which then, as far as that part's concerned, we should probably take a look at the player that the Kraken are getting via this signing in Lindgren. He is, again, like I said, a left shot defenseman at 6 foot, about 200 pounds. Originally drafted in the second round by the Boston Bruins in 2016, having just turned 27. So I suppose one of the few upsides you can see of this signing is that Lindgren is at least on the younger end, especially compared to some of the other free agent signings that the Kraken have made over the last few years, and certainly some of the ones that they made last year. But even with that being said, Lindgren has had a bit of a tough go of it here in the last couple of years. Still, as far as his career is concerned, it has been a pretty good one to this point, or at least lengthy anyway. He's played in 405 games over 7 NHL seasons, where he has just 14 career goals and 88 assists for 102 points. So I think pretty clearly this is not a guy that they're looking at to produce much offensively from the defensive end. And heck, maybe it's even a third pairing type of defenseman that they're looking at down the road, though I don't really know why you're going out of the way to get a third pairing defenseman for $4.5 million per year, but that can be another part of the head scratcher of this signing. So then, if he's not going to provide much offense, you'd think that he'd be pretty good defensively, and to be perfectly honest, he was actually pretty good defensively a couple seasons ago. In his last year, having spent almost his entire career with the New York Rangers, until just the end of this last season where the Rangers traded him to Colorado. He spent the last few games there before playing with Colorado through their playoff run, and although it wasn't as long as Colorado would have liked it to be, he actually did play pretty well defensively in the postseason. But during the regular season, it was some tough sledding. As we look at the stat card via Dom Luszczyszyn's model, you can tell that while he doesn't offer a ton offensively, the defensive side of his game, which is supposed to be the strong part, was in fact the weaker part over the course of this last season. And while sure, he does have a reputation for being a little bit more of a physical player, and maybe this is just the Kraken trying to lean into adding some toughness on the back end or just to the roster in general, well, maybe that toughness is coming from somewhere other than hits. He does at least block a fair number of shots. He's good for about a block shot to a block shot and a half per game. But this last season, in just 72 games, he had only 80 hits. And sure, that's not a perfect stat by any stretch of the imagination. But at least as far as hits are concerned, or one of the ones he was credited for, he maybe isn't quite as physical as his reputation lets on. And regardless of how physical he is or not, analytically and even just by the counting stats, it's been 2 pretty bad seasons for him. Now, as far as the expected plus minus, again, you can see that 2 seasons ago, he actually did have a pretty good year there with the 5.7 expected plus minus, but then that dropped off pretty significantly 2 seasons ago until he just had a pretty dreadful year with a negative 8.6 in this last season between the Rangers and the Avalanche. So, yeah, maybe the 4x4.5 makes sense if this contract was signed 2 years ago when he was 25 and coming off of that good season. But given that he is now 27, pretty much right in the middle of his prime, if not starting to slowly come out of it here over the next few years, and already has shown some signs of decreasing productivity. Yeah, it's I mean, if it had been like a $1 or $2 million contract for the next few years, then sure, what the heck. But at $4.5 million, it's just not a contract that looks particularly good, even out of the gate, much less how it might look when he's 31. Really, the only potential upside that I see here is that for whatever reason, some changes the Rangers might have made to their system just wasn't really working out for Lindgren, or the role that he was playing in the team over the last couple of years wasn't working out for him. And maybe if he is in a more truly defense first and maybe leaning more on the physical end of the game, as the moves the Kraken have made this season do show that Lambert and Botterill want to take this team in a much more defensive, tough, physical direction. Maybe that type of system suits him a little bit better, and his defensive side of the game can bounce back. Again, the offensive side of the game is just not there. It's not going to be. Don't expect it to be. We're really just at this point looking for a guy that can be a true replacement for Oleksiak. And at this point, it doesn't seem like they necessarily got even what Oleksiak provides, much less any kind of upgrade. That is, anyway, again, aside from being 5 years younger than Oleksiak and getting paid at least a little bit, 100,000 per year less than Oleksiak, though that does look significantly better than what Oleksiak's contract looked at the time as far as percentage of the cap is concerned, especially with the cap likely to continue to increase significantly each year over the course of those 4 years. Whereas with Oleksiak's contract, it was stagnant until these last couple seasons. Percentage of the cap wise, it is a much better contract than what Oleksiak's looked like. Though, again, I don't think it even gets into the ballpark of being a good contract by the end of it. Or maybe honestly just gets out of the ballpark of being a bad contract. And one other thing definitely worth mentioning here before we move on from Lindgren's stats entirely, specifically because Botterill specifically mentioned this part of Lindgren's game in the questions he was asked about this signing following day one of free agency. And that is that Lindgren, as Botterill pointed out, has played a significant role in the penalty kill for the Rangers over the last few years of his career. And, well, at least this last season anyway, he was statistically, according to Dom Lucian anyway, one of the absolute worst defensive penalty killers in the entire NHL. So if this is a guy that the Kraken see as a role player in fixing the penalty kill, well, they're hoping for pretty much an entire 180 statistically from what he did last season. Now, again, the Kraken have their own advanced stats that are better and more informed than what we have publicly available, so maybe they see something completely different in Lindgren that we just don't have available via the publicly available stats. But at least from what we can see on the outside, Lindgren on the penalty kill might actually make things worse. Now, with all that having been said, obviously in the end, I hope I'm wrong about Lindgren and this contract. I hope by the end of it that it ends up looking like a pretty decent contract, heck, maybe even a good contract. I don't know that that's particularly likely, but it seems at least possible if Lindgren can turn back into the player or get back on the same trajectory that he was 2 seasons ago before the drop-off these last couple years with the Rangers. Maybe he just did need a scene change a couple years ago. It didn't happen early enough, and now he can get back on track with an entirely new system, a new group of teammates, and a new franchise, new surroundings and all that. Maybe he can get back to that player and continue to build off that over a couple of years. And by the end of it, this contract does age decently well. It's not entirely impossible. Again, unlikely, but hopefully that is what happens. Even if it does, though, there's still no getting around the fact that the Kraken, it does seem overpaid, at least in this moment, for the player that they're getting in Ryan Lindgren. That having been said, it wasn't completely out of the realm of what was going on across the NHL, as some other questionable defensive contracts were signed, so maybe the Kraken just really were locked into getting another middle pairing defenseman, and this just happens to be the price that had to be paid to get a middle pairing defenseman. Though, as I kind of pointed out earlier, if that was the case, maybe just don't force yourself into replacing a player that is still on your roster and deal with it next season or during the season if you absolutely need to via trade or something like that. At least the good news for the Kraken is that 2 potentially worse defensive contracts that were signed the same day did both go to the Kings. So as far as the Kraken hoping to back their way into the playoffs via a couple of teams in the division falling apart ahead of them, which would kind of have to be 2 of the Kings, Flames, and Canucks, maybe it's possible. But at least for now, it's a head scratcher at best and a bad contract at worst. At the very least, he's a young player and won't be 37 by the end of it. It is only 4 years. And I guess one other thing that I have not mentioned about the contract that does make this one not nearly as bad as some of the ones signed in previous years, specifically Chandler Stevenson's last year, is that for kind of the first time in a while, the Kraken sign a decently sized contract without any kind of no movement or no trade clause whatsoever. This is fully movable and tradable by the Kraken at any point should they choose to, which is a significant improvement from pretty much every other significant contract the Kraken have signed in the last few seasons. I mean, if you just go to the Kraken roster breakdown on Puckpedia, there are a lot of those shield or anchor icons that signify partial, full, no trade clauses or no movement clauses. So yeah, at least that's a small benefit to this contract versus some of the other bad ones that have been signed. And I suppose for what it's worth, the Kraken have pretty recently shown that they are at least capable of getting rid of some bad contracts when they got rid of the Burakovsky contract without taking any punishment. So I guess if this is the new going rate for middle pairing defensemen and Lindgren can at least get a little bit of improvement over the next year or two, then maybe his contract turns out to be pretty movable in a year or two's time, and this is all a bunch of complaining and doomsaying for nothing. Hopefully that turns out to be the case. At least for now, though, I think we can move on to the other, much more minor signing the Kraken made today, and that is a one-year, $1 million contract that they gave to veteran goaltender, two-time cup-winning goaltender, Matt Murray, who, at this point in his career, well, it's been a few years since those 2 Stanley Cups that he won with the Penguins, and it's been pretty much all downhill since the second Cup win. And at this point, he is very much a third goaltender that the Kraken are picking up, basically just insurance, and you could call it cups in the room. The Kraken sure do like having cups in the room, Stanley Cup winning experience, though this Stanley Cup winning experience is destined to at least start the season in Coachella Valley, especially if we're taking Botterill at his word that they are not going to be buying out Grubauer. It just gives them a little bit more veteran depth at the goaltender position should an injury happen to either Decord, especially with how much he's likely to get played, or Grubauer, or heck, maybe it's a performance issue with Grubauer and they just need to switch things up, which is not, at least based on last season, completely out of the realm of possibility. And that does get us back to that whole question: if they're not going to buy out Grubauer, what exactly is the vision for this season? And I think the writing on the wall is pretty clear. The Kraken don't really intend on making a full push to the postseason, at least not by making the roster significantly better anyway. Look, again, if they happen into it by large jumps forward being made by Beniers and Wright, or maybe it's just a change back to a defensive system that much more suits the roster that has been built, then great. Maybe again, the Canucks or Flames or Kings, 2 of those teams completely fall apart and the Kraken can find their way into a top 4 spot in the division. They might even need to find a top 3 spot in the division based on how the Central is looking, but that's a discussion for as we get closer to the start of the season. Maybe they find a way to back their way into the playoff, but more likely than not, based on the moves made so far, it seems like they're just kind of setting themselves up to start taking more swings next season. Who knows, maybe things fall apart entirely and the Kraken somehow end up lucking their way into the first overall pick, which could land them a generational type of talent, or at the very least a franchise-altering type of talent at the top of next year's draft. A draft that does look better and deeper than this year's draft, so it wouldn't necessarily be the worst thing to end up towards the top of it if you're not going to make the playoffs. But we can deal with that as the season goes along. I'm sure we'd like to see a team that's much more competitive, and if that is the case, that the Kraken don't see themselves as a realistic playoff contender going into the season, then it does make sense to just keep Grubauer on for another year and maybe buy it out next season if that's when you want to make the playoff push. Hope that he gets things turned around. That would be obviously ideal if Grubauer could turn back into a legitimately viable backup goaltender. But even if not, if you're not trying to make that push to the playoffs, then you might as well save yourself a couple years of dead cap if you are going to end up buying it out at the end of one more season. But with that, I think we've pretty much exhausted the conversation there is to be had about day 1 of free agency for the Kraken. Let me know if you disagree down in the comment section below, or just what your thoughts are on the moves that the Kraken made here on day one of free agency. If you can take Botterill at his word, there are no more big moves to be expected from the Kraken, at least in free agency. It's hard to tell from his comments whether that just meant the offseason in general, if they still are looking at trades, but it kind of seemed like he was suggesting that they're happy with what they've done so far in this offseason and aren't looking to make any more big significant moves. That is aside from at least two more fairly significant re-signings that they'll have to do with Capo Caco and Riker Evans. Ty Cartier also. Those three all extended qualifying offers as RFAs, so unless some sort of shenanigans happens with one or multiple of them via offer sheets, then it's just a matter of time before the Kraken eventually get those contracts signed, and we can talk about what those look like when they happen. Until then, though, again, I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comment section below. And as always, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and go Kraken.